and he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." Please be seated. It was a warm May day, still early in the spring in the Republic of Georgia. I was visiting a friend outside the city of Gori, and he had enlisted a couple cousins of his host family to lead us on a trip up into the mountains. They had a spot that they wanted to show us. All around us, the forest teemed with life. Solomon's seal emerging from the forest floor, bearing small and unassuming bell-shaped flowers. The oaks and maples glowing neon green with their new leaves just emerged from buds. We passed by bushes of jonjoli, a native flower that grows in clusters on trees that would later soon be harvested by villagers to be pickled and preserved and doled out over the course of the year ahead. We made our way up the dirt road that slowly and steadily narrowed into a single-track trail that wove its way up into the hills, through the green, into the deeper and darker forest, until we finally turned a corner, and there before us was a giant and ancient beech tree, and at its foot, rubble, crushed stone. As we made our way past the beech tree, we looked to our right, and there was a stone edifice. The iconic gray, almost pinkish sandstone that was used to build churches all over the country. And there was a wall with the familiar slits of windows with carved reliefs next to it. And eventually the church came into shape, though it looked as if the hill had swallowed half of it. This church, our Georgian guides told us, was built in the 11th century. And time had clearly taken its toll. The hill expanding, soil being deposited, leaves falling and detritus forming, moss growing on the roof, young saplings even shooting up out of it. It obviously had not been used in a long time. This church had laid fallow for centuries, maybe cared for by a few in the village, but its days of being a regular house of worship had long since receded into the past. And yet this for them was a site of pilgrimage, a place worth showing anyone who came to their village. They led us up there, and as we admired the church that seemed to be completely at one with the forest around it, they led us inside. We walked into its cruciform shape, walking in through each of the wings. It was dark inside, lit only by the little bit of light coming in through those slits of windows, the smell of damp earth, moss all around us. You could still see the painted mosaics on the walls, faded images from hundreds of years ago of Mary with the infant Jesus, saints whose names and stories I didn't know. Some of them painted over with graffiti dating back to somewhere in the middle of the Soviet era. Some still perfectly preserved. As we walked around the church, I was admiring the walls, admiring the shape of it, the structure of it, the oldness of it. And then I came to a spot on the east wing and heard one of our Georgian companions just abruptly say, "Stop there." I was trying to figure out, was it a safety thing? Had I done something wrong? What was going on? And then I saw our two Georgian companions approach the area where I stood, look ahead of them towards the east-facing wall and the window behind it, and bow deeply and cross themselves. And I realized this was the spot where the altar was. And for them, the space in the Georgian Orthodox tradition, the space behind the altar, behind the reredos, the wall of icons, that is the holiest of holies, the place where God is most present, the space where only the priests, only the deacons can enter. And still, hundreds of years after the last Mass, after the last Eucharist was celebrated at the table that once was there, for them, that space beyond that line was still holy ground, was still something to be revered and honored. It was the place where God's presence was most clearly and palpably felt. Long after any of the ancient prayers were chanted or said in that space, long after anyone gathered there as a congregation on Sunday mornings, long after the last candles to an icon were lit along the walls, this was still holy ground. In our Old Testament reading today, we hear part of the story, the saga of Jacob. Up to this point, Jacob had received a word from God that he would be the one to receive the inheritance from his father, which led to him tricking his brother Esau to receive that inheritance, to receive his father Isaac's blessing. And now Jacob has been sent out by his father, by Isaac, to go and find a wife in the birthplace of his grandfather Abraham, up in the region of Haran. And so he's undertaking this 500-mile journey on foot, maybe with the occasional horseback ride or camel ride. But early in his journey, he comes to a place where he's exhausted at the end of a long day, finds a stone to put his head on because perhaps there was nothing else better suited, and falls asleep. And in that spot, he has a dream. He's given a vision where suddenly he sees before him a ladder stretching from earth all the way up into the heaven. He can't even see the top of it. It reaches beyond even his imagination. And on that ladder, he sees ascending and descending angels of the Lord. Whether these are celestial beings or the souls who have gone before, he clearly identifies them as something that are as beings, as gifts from God. He sees them going up and down this ladder, and as he is admiring this vision before him, he feels a presence next to him. It's God standing with him. And God reaffirms the promise that God made to his grandfather Abraham. You and your descendants will number as much as the dust on the earth or the stars in the heavens. Your people will spread from east to west, from north to south. This will be your land for you to inhabit and to dwell upon. It's a promise of God's closeness to the people of Israel. But it's also an assurance of God's closeness to the land itself. That Israel would be a holy people, and the land that Jacob stood on was a holy land. He was standing on sacred ground. He was standing in a holy place. And he wakes from this vision and says, surely this is the house of the Lord. Surely God is in this place, and I had no idea. This is the house of the Lord, and this is the gate to heaven. He has this abiding sense of God's nearness that is connected to that place. That there is something about this spot that he has found himself. And he goes on to build a shrine in it, to mark it as Beth-El, the house of God. This story fits into a long tradition in the Old Testament of folks experiencing a landscape that is suffused with God's presence, where God shows up not only to people and in time, but in specific places, in places where they need God or places that God would lead them to. There's a sense that the story of the three angelic visitors who come to Abraham would not be the same were it not taking place there under the oaks of Mamre. And Moses' own experience of God in the burning bush, and later of receiving the tablets of the Ten Commandments on the Mount of Sinai, wouldn't be the same if they were not to happen in that very place, on that mountain, the place of the revelation of God. Such is the case here with Jacob in Beth-El, the house of God. And the story of Jesus would not be the same were it not for his birth in that stable in Bethlehem. Each of these moments, each of these experiences mark a place as sacred, as being a sort of thin place where God's presence is especially felt, where that barrier and boundary between earth and heaven fades away. And the people to whom God reveals God's self feel God's presence close, all surrounding them, within them, and right next to them. In our own time, I think there's a tendency to see this kind of belief in a sacred place, or its connected belief, a belief in angels, as being superstition, or as being kind of woo-woo, or being kind of out there. There's a tendency to reduce places to a sort of sameness, to being dots on a map, or coordinates or directions that you plug into Google and have it give you complete directions. And I think our relationship to places runs the risk of flattening them into all kind of being the same. Maybe at most, things to be consumed, places for us to take the backdrop to take pictures against, sites to have seen and to check off a list, or simply the background noise to our busy lives. But what this reading from the Old Testament shows is that the world is suffused with God's presence. That the places that we move through in our lives have the potential to be that ladder that bring us upward towards heaven, to bring us closer to God and for God to come closer to us. I think there are still places in the world where this sacred landscape is still experienced. A writer who I follow, Paul Kingsnorth, has been writing this series of reflections over the course of the past year on having visited 50 sacred wells in Ireland. And these are spots, wells that many of which date before Christianity, some to soon after Christianity came to the island of Ireland. And they're spots where water pours from the earth, where folks have experienced healings, or where they have offered prayers and had them answered. Places where God's presence is especially felt. And still today, you will find folks making pilgrimages to these wells, tying ribbons to signify their prayers and hopes for loved ones, leaving behind tokens of gratitude for their experiences of God's presence in that place and its healing and life-giving power. That day in the mountains above Gori, our two Georgian companions revealed to me that we were standing on holy ground, that it was a sacred place. And as they crossed themselves before that area where the altar once stood, I got a little glimpse of it. I felt what I believe was likely a little bit of what they felt. That sense of God's presence in that place, the thinness of it, that there in that church that has been sat dormant for centuries, God was alive in it, present to it and present to the people who stepped through that threshold onto that holy ground. So the invitation that I think that I'm hearing today in this passage from Genesis is to let ourselves experience holy ground, to pay attention to the world around us, to pay attention to God, the ways that God is revealing itself through those sacred places, to let ourselves be overwhelmed in awe at the view from a mountain summit, or to receive the gift of a deep and abiding peace sitting in a pine grove with a river quietly running through it. It's an invitation to step into a darkened and silent church and to experience God's presence within it. It's an invitation to be surprised by holiness. So in the moments that we least expect it, to receive the consolation of God drawing near to us, and to mark the places where that happens. To trust that that experience is not just a projection of our minds, but but as a testament to a world that is shot through with God's loving and abiding presence. So on this day, as we celebrate St. Michael and all angels, and look and experience a world that is more than as it presents itself to be, may we let ourselves stand on holy ground. Open our hearts to a God who is ever drawing near to us and drawing us nearer to God. May we seek out holy places so that we might be reminded that God is with us, alongside us, urging us forward, wrapping us in God's peace and consolation. May we look out and find a world that is ever revealing God's love to us.